Welcome to another episode here on Detection Engineering Dispatch. I'm Alex, hosting all of your detection engineering content and bringing the very latest in what's happening in the DE space. So if you enjoy our content and want to stay in the loop with it, join us live on Zoom here bi-weekly, or you can catch the replays on our YouTube channel and now available on Spotify. Now, today's topic is all about navigating the intricacies associated with data streams and pipelines, but we got a little bit of a twist for me and my guests. We're going to be tasting some Cal today with my boy Darwin Salazar. He is the author of Cybersecurity Pulse newsletter, which quite literally has the pulse on all of the market, which we all know is super populated with vendors. I think it's the market with the most vendors out there, and he's got the pulse on all the latest feature releases, hot tech, and publishes about it on a weekly basis. He's also the head of product over at Monad, a super cool and up and coming security data fabric startup. So Darwin, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I think it was about time you joined us here on Dispatch. We're so happy to have you here.
Howdy. Yeah, I was like, you guys are having all this fun without me. Where's my invite? But no, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for today's episode.
Tell us a little bit about you for those of you that don't have the pulse on the newsletter. Tell us what you write about and what you do for Monad.
Yeah. I consider myself a cybersecurity journeyman. I got my start in business continuity and disaster recovery as an intern at a financial firm out of DC. Then I went over to Ford Motors as an intern. Aside from that, I've also spent time in Israel learning offensive security during a 6-week fellowship there. I've also spent a couple of years doing medical device security at Johnson & Johnson. After that, I pivoted over to consulting in the cloud security space, more focused on Azure security and Azure detections within Splunk and Microsoft Sentinel. Familiar with the intricacies of KQL and SPL and all that good stuff. After that, I decided that Azure is interesting, but I want to get a taste of AWS and Google Cloud, what everyone else is doing there. So pivoted over to detection engineering at Datadog, where I was writing a bunch of the misconfiguration detections for the CSPM at Datadog. So when we think about the places where I've been and where I've gone and how I landed at Monad today as a product manager, it's more so been me following my curiosity. Mm-hmm. And that is also what has led to me creating the Cybersecurity Pulse newsletter, which is at a very high level, just captures what the latest features in product announcements, what's going on at the cutting edge of cybersecurity on a weekly basis, which also includes which startups are coming out of stealth, what problems are they tackling, and how are they tackling them, right? So I'm a huge advocate for anyone, like, just follow your curiosity and great things will come from it. And that's that's kind of like where I've been and how I've gotten to where I'm at today.
It's quite the journey. I mean, you've gone through the whole thing. Some can even say it's the right of way of passage. I mean, if you've done the cloud security, you've done the pen testing, you've built the detections, you've been on the offensive side, like that's quite literally almost a bit of everything. I can't think of a better person to have all of that, have a touch on the market, to be building product.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, and so today, I absolutely appreciate it. I think those different experiences that I had as a practitioner made me extremely empathetic to the user experience. So any friction that I would have with like black box detections where I can't understand how to reproduce this alert or investigate whether this is benign activity or actually nefarious activity, and I just have to wait for that alert to trigger again to see what may have caused it. Those experiences, not only did they frustrate me as a practitioner because it was actually slowing me down, but it also made me want to build better security products if I worked in product management. And so after a lot of thought, I figured, why not give product management a shot? And I really love it. And so here at Monad, we're building a security data ETL, or a security data fabric solution, to be able to solve some of those problems that detection engineering teams face, but also to create just a very good experience for security practitioners in a space that lacks the user experience that puts the security practitioner first, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Now, I think all of that is going to provide such great context for today's topic of the episode. And it's about navigating a lot of the intricacies in data pipeline and prioritization, which for some people, I mean, it's not the sexiest of topics, but I figured we could spice it up a little bit today with some mezcal.
Yes. Spicy indeed.
Smoky. Yeah. So, Darwin, what are you drinking over there?
So today I've got 400 conejos, which Spanish for 400 rabbits. And so this is a mezcal out of Oaxaca, where the majority of mezcal comes from, but a town called Tlacolula, Oaxaca. And the oven type of where it was roasted, where the piña of the agave was roasted, is a volcanic earth pit. In any case, this is a very journeyed mezcal that I'm very fond of. What are you drinking?
Excellent.
Today?
Well, I've got a couple options here. We love mezcal over at my house. So I've poured myself 3 little tiny sips for all of the 3 topics we're going to cover today. And I've got Casamigos, I've got Union, and then I've got over there the Dos Hombres, which, if you guys know and have seen Breaking Bad, it's a little bit of a spin-off business venture that literally the actors of the show, like Walter White and Jesse, they spun up, and now they're, instead of cooking something else, they're now producing their own mezcal brand.
Wow. And they've done a couple of showings here, or tastes, mezcal tasting here in Austin, Texas, which has been pretty cool. I haven't had the chance to go out and see them, but I think it's very indicative that the type of alcohol that they chose to produce is mezcal. So that in its own should like cause the audience to go and check out and taste some mezcal if they haven't already.
Honestly, it's pretty genius. But I've been keeping up with their Instagram brand, and apparently they put on these tastings, and they're the ones that are serving the drinks themselves, and they look like they're having a ton of fun doing it. I want to go.
It's a great job to have, especially after netting it so bigly with Breaking Bad, which was an award-winning show. So another thing, if you haven't checked out Breaking Bad, it's an amazing show. And I think it's still on Netflix, but
Definitely.
one of my favorite growing up for sure.
Yeah, I actually just came across it recently. I don't know why I waited so long, but it's amazing. I love it. It's probably top 3 on my list of my all-time favorite shows.
Nice.
Yeah. So, well, then cheers. Why don't we start with the first one before we get into talking shop?
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Salud.
I'm starting with Casamigos, which is the easiest one to drink, I would say, for
Awesome.
my listeners.
Awesome.
Ooh.
Yeah, we'll end.
It's the strongest out of everyone. Ooh, that one is good. That
Awesome.
one is really good. So, yeah, we'll end with my favorite at the end and can walk away with recommendations of some mezcal, but also some best practices on data pipeline and prioritization, right? And cost, of course. So first and foremost, Darwin, why don't we talk about the first topic here? And it comes to kind of which log sources to prioritize, right? If you're building your detection engineering team, if you're building and implementing your security technologies, and you're trying to kind of figure out where the hell to start. And we obviously know that all logging everything is a bit of an overkill. What do you think that the primary log sources teams should be prioritizing in 2024?
That's an amazing question and a great place to start too. So I'm a big fan of the Pareto principle, following an 80-20 approach, which means if you address this critical 20%, it should net you 80% results or benefit, right? And so when we think about, if I were the first security hire at an organization and I'm building out a detection function or SOC function, I start thinking about, number one, what type of business am I operating in? Is it a fintech company that has payment applications, or is it a streaming company like Netflix, which has streaming services and provides them to the wide audience, right? Mm-hmm. So number one is understanding the business use case of which we're serving. And then as you go and spider out, you think about what type of infrastructure are supporting the applications which are serving the business's customers. And so in the case of a payments applications, you will have your crown jewel databases, whether it's EC2 instances or EKS, Kubernetes services, or even Lambdas, whatever the compute is behind that app that's powering that application and serving it up to its users. Also, from an identity perspective, are there non-human identities that are allowing these systems to talk with each other to be able to send information back and forth? where once you've identified the crown jewels, you already know what is most attractive to attackers. And so when we think about it from a log source standpoint, especially for cloud, you have your control plane and your data plane. So for building out that detection and SOC function, I'm going to prioritize whatever assets are powering these crown jewels on the control plane. So it would be collecting the logs from, say it's AWS CloudTrail or Azure activity logs. I will start with collecting those control plane logs.
Mm-hmm.
And then that'll give me visibility into what actions are being performed against the resources. And in an ideal world, you will have very tight knit and right fitted permissions and RBAC across the organization. But we all know that's not true. We have users that have privileged identities. And so
attackers are just logging in with these stolen credentials. So we can't just assume that the MFA or even the right user is using the right resource to the right asset. Hackers are logging in with compromised credentials at that point. So at that point, we have to look at the activity after the login as well.
Exactly. And so for a lot of these identities which are compromised and attackers are conducting credential stuffing attacks or getting the credentials off of dark web and able to log in,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty much the Wild West or free range for those attackers once they're inside those four walls. And so we want to be able to monitor what types of activities are performed against these assets. So if someone turns off logging for my Kubernetes cluster, and
Mm-hmm.
that is a defense evasion technique, we want to be alerted on that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is within the data plane of cloud resources to see if an attacker has enumerated all of the keys within a key vault, we want to be notified that as well. So not only do we want to be notified and alerted when an action is performed against the resource, but also inside of the resource. So I would start with monitoring control plane and data plane logs. Yeah, those
so
are.
You're talking like AWS Cloud Trail, Azure Activity Trails. You're talking GCP trails.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, so Azure Activity Logs, Google Cloud Audit Logs, and AWS Cloud Trail would give us the control plane logs. And then the data plane logs are a bit more intricate and granular, and there are different ways to configure them across the different cloud providers, but they have to be turned on one by one for the different services. So AWS S3 or Azure storage buckets, if you want to get logging for that, you have to enable it specifically within that resource or have a rule or policy that enables it by default. And then you have to do the same thing for Azure AKS and the same thing for Azure PostgreSQL, etc. You have to do it on a per service basis. So we've covered the cloud. Next thing you want to do is go to your identity provider, whether it's Okta or Azure Entra ID, formerly known as Azure
Active Directory. I can't tell you how much negative news, just keyword search away, there is around Active Directory and Entra ID. Like just in the past year, it's like it's consistently attacked.
Well, I think this one is a double whammy. There's negative news around Entra ID for multiple reasons. First off is like Active Directory is something that's been around for like 20, 30 years at this point, or maybe even more. And so the security community and the broader IT community has just gotten so accustomed to calling it Active Directory. Just last year, Microsoft changed the name to Entra ID, which is confusing as hell, but it's their suite of identity products. The second thing is that the identity provider is what people call the new perimeter. Once you have access to an identity within a cloud environment or on-prem environment, you can start learning more about that environment, even if the permissions or the access of that identity are contained a bit. So identity is the new perimeter. Entra ID is a very high value log source. So with Okta and other identity providers, you're able to see user login activity. If a new user was created with a new admin account was created within your Azure environment or on-prem environment, you should be able to detect that by writing detections or monitoring that log source. So identity is just with identity and monitoring for cloud control plane and data plane, you can probably get a good 60, 70% of the detections that you need and visibility that you need to be able to alert when nefarious activity is being performed against your crown jewels. So I would start with those two, 100%.
Absolutely. I would add like the single sign on, like account creation logs, any kind of MFA that is changed, only because I recently went in on identity, like provider admin account takeovers. I noticed that critical API actions cannot be protected by policies in the same way as actual admin console access. So you can get away with a lot of APIs that you may not be able to get away with in the UI. So if you already have an access token and you're doing all these things through API, it can actually bypass your policy.
Interesting. Yeah, that's it. And this is indicative and also something that we'll kind of be touching on today is the divergence in terms of the treatment that vendors give to different portions of their product, whether it be data format in the output versus what you see in the UI. There's kind of like that divergence. And I think AWS also has like some shadow APIs and type of access that you could get that you can't get in the UI, but you can get it via API. If you're a user or a security team lead, if you're not interacting with that API, it's very hard for you to account for that delta, leaving you with a blind spot. So that's interesting.
I really liked the high value log sources that you mentioned. I think that's a good way to articulate, especially the priority, because we can't log it all, right? And it's fascinating how effective log prioritization can reduce a lot of that unnecessary noise, but also compute, because compute can get kind of expensive.
Yeah, 100%. And so the last log source that I would tell anyone who's starting out a detection function today to log for is endpoint logs. So,
Right. Of course. How could we forget that one?
yeah. Well, I'm so gung ho on cloud and identity, but also you can't forget about the traditional endpoints, obviously. So within Windows endpoints, monitoring for Windows security events, there are certain key indicators of tampering on your crown jewel boxes, but also in your Active Directory domain forest. Often, especially in hybrid and on-prem environments, the identity provider is hosted on a Windows server.
Mm-hmm.
And Active Directory server. And so monitoring for those endpoint logs and that anomalous activity there is, well, probably with identity, cloud, and endpoint logs, that'll get you 80% of the way through to very strong visibility. The rest of that
And
10% of the
what are you
pie.
talking? Like file creation, file execution, PowerShell, like that route just kind of went on in my head was like, do I need to enable Sysmon? Are my CrowdStrike EDR alerts enough? Do I need to look more into the raw telemetry in CrowdStrike, or are the alerts just okay? I'm thinking about all these things because I feel like CrowdStrike alerts are not suffice. Like you can't just look at the alerts. You have to do more introspection where your raw events come into play.
100%. And you'll have more insight into this than I do because I feel like you live and breathe detection engineering. And since I've been far removed from it for the past year and a half or so, you're definitely the SME here. But as you mentioned, remote code execution, monitoring for file creation, those very anomalous events that make your ears perk up. But also, you brought up a very good point. Not solely relying on the detections that the vendor is providing you, but also understanding that your environment is unique and what's normal to you or what is anomalous to you is different than the baseline of what the vendors are creating detections for. And so when we think about fine-tuning detections and fine-tuning things that come out of the box, it lines up extremely well with what you said, like not just taking out of the box detections and shipping them and expecting that they're going to get you all the way there. No, that's probably going to lead to a lot of false positives.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to lead you to running around in circles. So you brought up a very good point there.
So, in summary, high value log sources to prioritize cloud access control plane logs, cloud trail server access logs, data events, and endpoint logs.
Yep. And identity providers. So whether
And
it's Okta, Active Directory, or Entra ID, there are several other identity providers, but you want to be monitoring who has access to your environment, what their login activity looks like, what permissions they have. And also admin account creation is a very big red herring, especially if an admin account was spun up and then struck down within 24 hours. You want to find out what actions that account performed. So if you're not monitoring your identity provider or any of those critical sources, you're left with a massive gap in your detection strategy.
Absolutely. Wow. What a heavy topic to start off the chat.
It's something that for more mature programs, they already have nailed down. But when we think about startups and late stage startups like Series B and Series C, once they start making their first security hires, like they have to start thinking from first principles. And so hopefully that gives a first principles view at the core and high priority log sources.
Yeah, definitely. Let's break up the next topic with the next tasting I have for you guys. And by the way, I think I kind of forgot how Dos Hombres tasted like because it's actually really hard to get. I had to go venture out to my binnies because it's you can't just get it anywhere. So I feel like it'll be kind of like tasting it for the first time on this next one. So I wish you could taste it. It's so good. So this one is called Dos Hombres. And again, it's the Breaking Bad spin-off business. I don't know if I would recommend our listeners to try it for the first time, like if they're just starting off with mezcal, because it's kind of like, well, hold on the nose, it's very fruity and it's like in your face fruity. It kind of almost kind of smells like mango. But when you taste it, it's completely different than how it smells, like completely different, like night and day. Because when you taste it, it's more like, I don't know, like a leather, like kind of like it's very complex. I would say it the taste of it is not how it smells. It's very leathery. But then if you are familiar with tasting mezcal always has like an aftertaste, which is honestly why a lot of people drink it because it's really smoky. That smoky aftertaste is what makes people so drawn to it. And the aftertaste of Dos Hombres is incredibly clean and long. And I think that's why I really like it. Even though I wouldn't say it's my favorite, it's typically like it's all worth it. That kind of complex feeling and tasting and smelling is worth it just for the aftertaste. If I had to explain it. Now, clearly I'm not an expert at explaining.
Yeah, I think you described it extremely well. Though I haven't had it, I think Mezcal has unique taste profiles. For our listeners who have not yet tasted it, you did a great job of kind of
Really?
describing the journey, right? Because it's not all sweet. It's similar to whiskey, where you have that very bold taste profile where it's smoky. Some whiskey is smoky and sweet, is more so in your face and smoky. And the aftertaste it reminds me of Dr. Bronner's
Who's that?
Dr. Bronner's is a Castile soap. And if you're not familiar with it, no worries.
Oh, yeah.
The peppermint, if you even just wash your hands with it, your hands are tingling after. You feel like, so with Mezcal, the aftertaste leaves your mouth kind of tingling from the smokiness. So
Okay.
the leathery description, I think, is an interesting touch. And I think leather in some cases is smooth, but in terms of tasting leather, I probably wouldn't want to taste or wash down leather. Mezcal,
It's definitely not one of those that you take a shot of.
which is why I love it. And the last thing I'd say on this go around for this shot about mezcal is that I was sitting in a small village in Oaxaca, Mexico, called Mazunte, and
Okay.
it's on the Pacific coast, a little bit south of Puerto Escondido. And I met this person who told me to take a sip of the mezcal, swish it around. When you
Oh,
swish it around your mouth, it breaks down the polysaccharides, which is an element from the agave. It breaks it down. And so when your body digests the mezcal, it has much more subtle impact on your liver. So mezcal is
oh.
actually one of the healthiest forms of liquor, if not the healthiest liquor that you can have.
Well, as if I needed another reason to drink mezcal. It's healthy. I didn't need another one, but that one definitely will do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that me and you are on the same page about mezcal because it's my favorite drink.
It's fantastic. It's also one that I wouldn't necessarily mix with other drinks. I know some people prefer mezcal in their margaritas, but I prefer it alone by itself just to enjoy the taste and the aftertaste.
I could see that. I'll offer you one cocktail pairing: mezcal and maracuya or passion fruit,
Oh,
and a little bit of tahine and lime. Check that out and let me know what you think.
I wonder what the Brazilians think about that. I want to ask them about their maracuya. They're obsessed with their core drink, right?
Yeah, so they do the caipirinha
Mhm.
with maracuya
Mhm.
passion fruit and muddled mint and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So next time you're at a Brazilian steakhouse,
Ooh.
definitely check out the caipirinha with the maracuya. You will be mind blown.
Yeah, absolutely. So, next topic is a very important one because if you have all the right log sources in place, but you don't have the right properties aligned, mapped, parsed to fire up your detections, honestly, we're back to square one. And so, when it comes to data sources, mapping your data sources, but also ensuring the pipeline stream, the quality is effective. I feel like this is one of the common pitfalls and challenges that organizations struggle with. And in your experience, why do you think that is? Why is it so difficult? Why is it so tedious? Why is it so intricate to keep up with your data pipeline hygiene?
And that's a great way to put it. Hygiene is, I think, a key word here that we could drill down on and spend even a couple episodes talking about because,
True.
yeah, as we talk about log replenishment and all of that good stuff, hygiene goes a long way. A little bit of forethought in how you want to handle your data and store it and query it goes a long way as it relates to the hygiene portion. But now when we talk about the data quality and the variance of formats across the different log sources and data sources. Because now, not only are we talking about the IDP and cloud logs and endpoint logs, but we're also talking about all of the other security solutions that security teams have in house. So, vulnerability management, any GRC compliance type of data that they have access to, application security findings and alerts, all signal or data that a security team has access to, that's now being brought into the picture. And so we have to consider multiple things: the velocity slash latency requirements for different data sources. For logs, you want it as real time as possible so that you can
Yeah.
build detections off of it and be notified as things are happening. But for something like risk and compliance, then you can rely on something like batch processing, where you pull it maybe once or twice a day every 12 or 24 hours. But in any case, all of that data is extremely valuable in helping you get an understanding of where your security posture is and what to prioritize for remediation, right? So if you have ultimately for prioritization and context, the more data that you have access to, the more visibility and the more you can contextualize into your teams like, hey, forget about this 90% of vulnerabilities. Let's prioritize this 10% because
Mhm.
we're publicly exposed across those endpoints or buckets, whatever the case may be. The more context you have, the better. Now, when we talk about when taking that approach, you have to consider the noisiness of the data sources. And there's a ratio, there's like a golden ratio of noise to value when we consider data sources. So something like VPC NetFlow logs or Azure Network Security Group flow logs, they are extremely noisy because they're based on transactions and allow deny on traffic that's coming through that given VPC or network security group. So the noise to value ratio is tricky to play around with there. That's one factor to consider. The velocity is another factor to consider, but the other thing to consider is the formats in which they output in. So some data sources output in the fields are all enumerated out. They're not nested. You don't
Mhm.
have to do any wrangling or parsing to get the key fields that you need. And guess what? They're probably the field names are probably titled so that they're descriptive of the value within that key.
And that is the most ideal case.
That's the ideal case, right? Pretty JSON, all enumerated out. That is heaven, right? Now, that is not always the case. In fact, that is rarely the case.
Mm.
When we talk about data coming off of endpoints from agents, it's typically in raw log format, just
Yeah.
dumped on you. You have to kind of parse through it and clean it up and probably
And sometimes it's cut off. Like if you have an encoded command and it extends the length and you're trying to save some money and you only have it cut after a certain time, like you're not seeing the whole and like full legitimate log. And that's kind
right.
of in that fucks up with the integrity.
100%. And so now we're talking about tourniqueted logs, which are it's an incident response team's worst nightmare, where you have logs going into a SIM and
And they're not.
you have an incident, that data source. The incident response team goes and looks at the logs for that source and finds out that after line 300 or 400 within the sent over log event, that data is not being collected. That's a blind
Mhm.
spot that you can account for if you know about it. But if you don't know about it, it's very difficult to pinpoint unless you're in an incident type of scenario. JSON is one format. There's also XML raw log format. There are various formats. There's also ECS, and OCSF is a new format, which is a collective effort across security vendors to unify and normalize data fields across many data sources.
Sure.
And before I dive into,
I know IBM tried to do that with the sticks movement, and then with the OCF, are we going to standardize on?
that's a great question, and one I would love to know the answer to as well. But before we jump over to OCSF, I wanted to bring up a very simple use case to bring the point home to the listeners. If we think about three very popular identity activity log sources like Google Workspace and Azure Entra ID, and we think about a field that is critical for any detection written against these log sources, like usernames. Each of those, if you look at the API reference docs, the key name is different across those three sources. So for Azure ID, it may be email. For Okta, it may be emails. And for Google Workspace, it may be email address. So if I'm a detection engineer writing identity detections, I have to account for that variance within my detection logic. Not only does that take up more compute and is more costly because it's adding additional lines to my query, but also how can I ensure that I account for all email addresses across all of my identity sources or any detection that I would want to write that relies on that email address? That variance makes it extremely difficult or even just tedious and annoying to account for when writing a detection. I should be able to write a detection that triggers on one normalized way of spelling or outputting email addresses in an ideal world. Why haven't we gotten there yet? And it's because vendors, number one, vendors don't talk to each other, but also this is a problem that has manifested itself over time and that we didn't account for at the inception of security operations as a function and as a practice. So now we're having to deal with all this tech debt, and OCSF, the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework, is an attempt from multiple organizations, I think over 100 plus organizations, including Splunk, AWS, Monad, we're in the OCSF as well, Anvalogic. It's more of a community effort and open source effort to normalize the variance across all of these data sources, right? And so we are getting there, but we haven't necessarily centralized on one. And to your point of IBM creating sticks, that was for threat intelligence, right? And so that could also be applied to security operations, and it is. But then there's also ECS, which is Elastic's framework. There are so many out there, but OCSF is the newest one, which promises to unify everything. Has that been the case? No, but it has made things better. So we could talk about taking
strides in that direction.
Right. And we can talk about some of the gaps and how different vendors are addressing those, but we still got a bit of ways to go, I would say.
Definitely. I think email addresses are going to be one of the key things as more people are being cloud native, and you start to think about the detection that correlates a user back to see who actually did X thing, and it has to be email addresses as their primary sign into everything. And if it's so different across all of these platforms, I can't even imagine what that must be like in multi-cloud settings. I mean, we have customers that have those. They have GCP, they have Azure, they have Entra. So it's like, do you need your own security, your own CISO for each of these platforms? That eliminates the centralized ceremony of a detection operation. I don't know. It's a problem that we definitely have to tackle.
And that brings up a point of within a mature security operations function, you need folks who are very intimately knowledgeable about that data source, which are the fields of value that detections are typically written against, which are the fields that are not so valuable that can be dropped. Intimate knowledge about the data that you're collecting is crucial for mature security operations, and that's the only way in which you'll be able to detect the variance across your different priority log and data sources, is if you have people who know their stuff and have tested and written detections against these things. But otherwise, when you onboard a new data source or log source, you need to footprint the thing to be able to identify what are its shortcomings, how can we normalize this with the rest of our data? How can we, what are the fields of value? Things, asking those questions and actioning based on the response to those questions is key. And it's you typically only see it at mature security operations functions.
And that's a great topic, one of which we're going to cover in the third segment of Cybersecurity Awareness Month with Rihanna Schultz. We're going to talk about, well, what are those new skill sets that we need in this modern age of data lakes and cloud native, in this cloud native world? Like, does it mean a lot anymore if you know how to set up data centers and VMware's ESXi servers? Like, should I be just focusing on those like cloud certs so that you know exactly those kind of properties and those formats? Like, I would say yes, I would want to hire someone on my team that is more a cloud expert versus like a 15-year data center person. Like it doesn't apply anymore.
100%. Yeah, it's as we as a security industry kind of unbundle from we've identified certain shortcomings with traditional SIEMs and the data center approach that served us. Now we're moving more so into a cloud native world where compute is much cheaper, and we have very nice data warehouses and data lakes and different storage types of solutions. We're seeing some enterprises and security teams building out their own SIEM solutions. And that is an extreme, but in a way, it's hinting at security practitioners are becoming so much more data centric and data savvy compared
absolutely.
to what, depending on an out of the box SIEM solution as we did back in the past. So that'll be an interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing about, because it's definitely a new skill set that security practitioner needs today in 2024.
I have a theory that the security practitioner and the data scientist role will morph into one.
I think your theory is on point. I've been writing a blog series for Monad called Data Engineering for Cybersecurity. And I think if you did a Venn diagram of what detection engineers do and what data engineers do, there's a lot of overlap in the middle there.
Literally. Well, last topic. I feel like we were like, this is only going to take 30 minutes and we're good. We're like, oh no, this is going to totally take like 45.
Yeah.
But the last one is short and sweet. It's pretty to the point, but it's probably one of the most important topics because that's what's really going to lay the land, right? Because if there's going to be no money for it, I mean, money talks, right? But before that, I want to taste the last of the mezcal. This one I haven't tried before. This one is Mezcal Union, which is also from Mexico and allegedly from Oaxaca. I'm excited to try this one. To the nose, I would say, as far as how it smells, it doesn't smell like as crazy as Dos Hombres. So yeah, this one smells honestly just like alcohol.
You're more everyday mezcal, probably.
Well, okay, coming to you live from Alex's palate. Let's see. Obviously smokiness, but it is more earthy and it's not as spicy, so less on the pepper side. It's giving like minerals, kind of like a tap water from Europe, but still clean, very crisp, but also a little bit citrusy, but not in your face, but just like a little bit. I don't know if I had to paint the picture, like it's kind of like, I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Legends of the Fall?
I have not,
With
unfortunately.
Brad Pitt? I don't know. It feels like kind of like that movie.
Interesting.
Yeah, like you're in the desert and there's like cowboys and everybody's in dresses and it's like the Wild West, and then this is what that tastes like.
Interesting. What do you say? Which one would you recommend to someone who has not tried mezcal before? Which of the three?
Definitely not Union. I would say it's my least favorite. So I don't know what I'm gonna do with this whole bottle.
You could give it to a family member. They will appreciate it.
I'm gonna go with Casamigos. Man, I feel like that's gonna make me so like not demure, like not cultured. Casamigos was the best one out of all of them.
Nice. Well, yeah, interesting. So the Dos Hombres versus the Casamigos, Dos Hombres is just stronger, more potent, and the Casamigos is more entry level friendly, right?
Casamigos, I would recommend Casamigos for anyone who's starting their mezcal journey.
Nice.
Anybody who wants a nice, like the smokiness, the aftertaste, the easiness, you can mix it with a drink, with another cocktail. But Dos Hombres is like very much venturing out. Like if you want to try, a nice special edition of mezcal, it's not what you typically think of mezcal. I would.
Nice. Thank you. Straight. Straight from the expert.
I'm not an expert. I bet you someone's going to be in the comments and they're going to be like, oh my God, that is so uncultured.
Yeah. Yeah, Casamigos has gotten a bad rep for how popular their tequila is, but I think there's proof in the pudding. There's a reason why they're so popular. So
I think they're just going with the easy route. They just got to go with what, what everyone's going to like the 80/20 rule, the prioritization.
yeah, prioritize the mass public, and we'll create. Yeah, they've got some unique top shelf stuff, but I think their middle of the shelf stuff hits the nail on the head for the majority of the public, of the mass public. So a beautiful bottle. For those listening, it's a black, smoky kind of concrete looking bottle.
Yeah, it does look like a concrete. That's true.
Yeah. So
And it's from George Clooney. He's the sponsor. He's sponsored it, or he's like the spokesperson.
awesome. Shout out to George Clooney.
Well, or his wife, the woman behind the man.
That too. Always, there's always behind a great man. They say there's always a great woman propping him up. So shout out to Miss Clooney as well.
All right. Cost optimization. How do we apply the 80/20 rule to log sources? How do we, focus, make sure that those high value log sources are aligned to our cost strategy?
So today in 2024, it's a much different time than even 2018 or 2020. Today, companies are trying to do more with less. So not only are they trimming back on headcount, unfortunately, but also trimming back and being very cost conscious, especially of their cloud usage and compute and all the other technical costs that they've accumulated over time during their cloud migration. And so when we think about how expensive the cost associated with collecting several terabytes a day of security data and what that compounds into over time and what that bill just for ingest and egress of data looks like over a year. Some Fortune 500s are even looking at 7-figure bills just for data ingress and egress. That is,
oh my gosh.
When you think about Fortune 500s, yeah, they have the pocketbook, but at the end of the day, they have to respond to investors, and the investors respond. Like the CFO is looking at where do we optimize for cost. And so cost optimization of security data sources is key. You want to more so collect the data of high value. So looking back at the log prioritization, data source prioritization discussion that we had, for those key data sources, also, there are data sources which are not necessarily quote unquote security data sources like telemetry, traces, and application performance monitoring logs, which may hint to anomalous or nefarious activity against a crown jewel asset. If you have a blank check, as Meta, Facebook, or Walmart may have, you want to collect those data sources. Because they can hint to something that a higher level AppSec or point log won't be able to demonstrate. Seeing the execution of calls within the application trace is huge, but for any medium-sized enterprise that is more cost conscious, you don't want to collect traces, APM, or non-security logs. So number one thing when it comes to cost optimization, collect what you absolutely need. And you could go down the route of taking the 80/20 principle as we had previously discussed. Next is for those data sources which you are collecting data from, determine which events are of high value or indicative of anomalous activity. Often, if activity is being performed by a certain whitelisted IP address or an IP range that you know is very noisy and also of low security value, you can drop the events that come from that IP range and not ingest it into your SIM solution. Another thing that you can do is for alerts and sending alerts from your different security solutions, whether it's endpoint security, AppSec, phone management, you can drop the low and informational severity findings from that data source and either drop it into a cold storage S3 bucket or just drop them entirely. At the end of the day, I always think to have a historical record of all of your findings. You may go back and do some threat hunting or some retrospective analysis of things, and having that data is key. And also for compliance purposes, I think PCI requires financial firms to store logs for 7 years or 3 years. There's a retention period associated there. but low in informational findings, they are often the noisiest of all. Ingesting those into a SIM or a data lakehouse or warehouse is going to prove more costly than the value that they can actually bring. It adds more noise for your detection or vulnerability management teams to sift through. So dropping low value events is also key. Collect only what you absolutely need. Start with that approach and then trim the fat, manicure the hedges for the log sources which you are collecting by collecting the events and the findings that truly matter for those sources. And I think trying to brainstorm or just think here if there's anything else on the cost optimization front.
No, I think that is such sound advice for like filtering out unnecessary, data fields, especially for, companies struggling with their SIM ingest costs, which is everyone, like literally everyone. That I can't think of anyone else that doesn't think, oh yeah, my SIM ingest is too expensive, and then we're like, and then we're growing. Their data growth volume is growing year on year. It's not uncommon to be generating more data at 50% increase year on year. That's not an uncommon metric, or I've seen it grow even. And therefore, that's why it's even less common for not all of the data to make it to the SIM, right? Some half of it even stays out of the SIM. And that's obviously putting a lot of people at risk. And I like what you mentioned about using a data warehouse for that long-term retention. That's obviously also becoming more common with all of these great storage options like the Databricks and Snowflake and the Snowflakes of the world and Azure Data Explorer. But I mean, would you say, are there any best practices to ensure that you're not leaning too far to the right, like to ensure that cost saving doesn't come at the expense of your detection capability?
That's a great question.
It's like you're trying to save some bucks, but what if you miss out on something critical?
Yeah, 100%. And I think a prime example of this that most people struggle with is cloud network flow logs. So like like Azure Network Security Group logs or AWS VPC logs, they're extremely noisy, but they paint a picture and they show you exactly what is going on within the VPC network activity, who's pinging a certain cluster or a certain network. It's sort of like the today's network firewall. And so having it be so noisy, yet also having the answers to what's going on within your network, it's a tough line to tote. If teams don't know how to filter out and remove the low value activity from that network, or they don't understand what is normal to that network, then they won't truly be able to filter out and make sense of those logs. Some people just say, why collect NSG flow logs if they're so noisy and they provide such little value unless you know how to filter it out? Ideally, everyone should be collecting cloud net flow logs, but it's just so expensive and difficult to sift through that most people end up not collecting net flow logs, which leaves them with a massive blind spot and relying on other compensating controls. So it's a great question that a lot of teams are still wrangling with and fighting with today.
Worth mentioning that this is actually a really great use case that it does solve, is that you put those really high, volumetrically high VPC network logs into a data warehouse, or a very cost-effective modern data warehouse like Snowflake, or a cheaper one like Databricks. And what you can do is cross-correlate against your EDR detections, against your SIM, by effectively decoupling where we run detection from the storing layer. That's what Anvologic does. We take all of the glory without having to pay for the storage costs. So it's one of our biggest use case. I had to plug it in.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like volleyball. I just serve it up for you and you spike it. I'm a huge fan.
Speaking of which, I'm literally playing volleyball tonight.
Nice. I love volleyball. I'm a huge proponent of the approach that's taking of being when we think about security operations, taking a multi-data platform approach, because some data is better served in different spaces. So like for real-time detection, you want that in a SIM, or you'll want it in a data warehouse or data lake like Snowflake, which has your detections in it. And then for compliance, risk, or even for risk and compliance type of data, you want it stored in a more long-term storage bucket that is not going to eat up so much cost. And so that's like a cold storage S3 bucket, or a data warehouse, whatever the
right.
case may be. Different data is better stored in different places. And I think Anvologics makes it easier, not only by providing the blueprints and also the infrastructure to enable that, but also by shining a light on that this approach is possible. Because
If you need help getting the data there, that's where Monad comes.
exactly. And we may be working on some, or we maybe not, but yeah.
Well, good. I think that about did it. That was an incredible 3 rounds of topics of best practices and some Mezcal recommendations as well as a leave behind. Of course, I need to plug in Jeanette's favorite questions that we're using to compile a mashup of all of our guests' answers to these questions. And it's, what do you love the most about the detection engineering community? And what would you like to see more of in the community?
Absolutely. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think what I love most about the detection engineering community is the crowdsourcing nature of detections and also the sharing of how different teams are fine-tuning different detections. So ultimately, kind of like the open nature of security teams saying, to monitor this service, these are the detections that we're using. And that's where Sigma comes in, and a lot of these open source detection libraries come into play. But you don't see that across every security function. Like, different organizations take different approaches to vulnerability management and AppSec. But for detection engineering, there's kind of like community focus, exchange, information and value exchange based culture and vibe to it, which makes the lives of practitioners a lot easier because they're fighting a very massive challenge and battle. Right.
It's nasty.
Yeah. And then the second part of the question is, what would I like to see more of? More data science and more detection engineering and security, more broadly, security industry adopting advanced data centric approaches like data science and data engineering to solve cybersecurity problems.
Oh, we are absolutely behind that one. Here first on Dispatch. It's going to be the same role eventually.
Yep. And it's similar to software engineers now venturing into application security. Yeah. We need more of that. We need more data scientists becoming detection engineers or threat hunters, because when you're looking back at terabytes and petabytes of data, there are patterns in there that have answers to your security questions that can influence your security roadmap. Yeah. For a traditional detection engineer or security practitioner, it's hard to sift through that. But data scientists have, that's what they're trained on, is deriving patterns from asking
questions out of your data. Just us is just asking security questions, but there's still questions at the end of the day.
Exactly. Bingo. So that's one thing I'm very passionate about and would love to see more of.
Yeah, that's such a good one. Well, then that is a wrap and the close of this episode, the second of our Cybersecurity Awareness Month lineup series. I had a blast tasting Mezcal with you, Darwin, and talking shop on some of the most critical things that our listeners should consider and think about when they're applying to their ETL pipeline and their strategy. And of course, you're always welcome here on Detection Engineering Dispatch. I hope you have an amazing rest of your week, your quarter, and I hope to see you very soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. It was extremely fun. And last shot. Cheers.
Last shot. Cheers. Oh, that was the Dos Hombres.
Yeah. You have to be ready for that.
Oh, that was not a good one. I thought I was going to love it and I didn't.
You got to mentally prepare for it.